Look at the ceiling of the room you are in right now and realize that the average apartment building in any major American city is silently sitting fewer than 72 hours from zero food. Not a shortage, complete caloric exhaustion. For the urban apartment dweller staring at 600 square feet of limited floor plan, the reaction to preparedness is almost always the same resignation. I simply do not have the space that those homesteaders with basements and barns have. But that conclusion misses something profound. It misses the hidden engineering reality of the very box you sleep inside. There is a physics to your floor, a chemistry to your closet temperature, and a cubic inch mathematics governing your survival that nobody on social media is explaining. The information being ignored is stark. Research from CoreSite indicates American retailers will shutter roughly 7,900 physical locations in the coming year, with major grocery conglomerates aggressively thinning their urban and lower-income regional footprints. The Department of Agriculture confirms over 17 million citizens already reside within officially designated food deserts, census blocks where supermarket access has collapsed. Meanwhile, the fragile last-mile delivery networks threading into dense city cores have experienced what logistics experts quietly call structural erosion for 3 straight years, a silent thinning of the backup systems. The government's emergency authority tells every family to keep a 3-day buffer. The reality is that most high-rise units do not possess 3 hours of buffer. If your address is an apartment, the game is not about how many tin cans you can hoard. It hinges on factors the preparedness community almost universally overlooks: the distributed load engineering of your floor joists, the heat island effect cooking your shelf life, and the ruthless spatial economy that determines what actually fits. Get this wrong and you are not merely facing spoiled groceries. You risk smashing through the 40-pound per square foot structural tolerance engineered into residential flooring under the International Residential Code. That is not a mess. That is a structural failure waiting to happen. We are leaving behind the fantasy of the countryside bunker today. The new discipline is strategic compression, building a genuine nutritional fortress inside 800 square feet without violating the laws of gravity, legal engineering standards, or food science. By the time you finish this analysis, you will possess a 3-layer evaluation system for any urban cache, the dead volume architecture that converts invisible voids into usable storage, and the identity of the single most energy-dense survival item currently evaporating from wholesale supply chains, the one food that packs more biological fuel per cubic inch than any competitor. So let us confront the arithmetic. Chapter 1. The landscape. Why the clock is ticking now. Before cataloging items, we must establish the wider terrain because the city prepper is not bracing against a vague ghost. They're responding to 3 documented accelerating pressures. The first pressure is the just-in-time skeleton. Contemporary supermarket logistics are calibrated for roughly 2 to 3 days of on-shelf product. There is no hidden cavern of backup stock in the receiving bay. The visible inventory is the whole strategy. When the delivery chain snaps due to a fuel spike, a labor action, or a freight lane collapse, the display aisle is all there is. The second pressure is the physical contraction of retail geography, with nearly 8,000 closures projected for the immediate future, continuing a massive pattern from the prior year. The redundant geographic coverage that once defined American food security is being surgically dismantled. These shutdowns swarm in exactly the thin-margin, densely populated zones and remote communities where alternatives are already scarce. These locations often overlap perfectly with the food desert maps the USDA has updated for years. The third pressure is the urban thermal battery. According to the Environmental Protection Agency and decades of metropolitan climatology, concrete city cores operate 1 to 7 degrees hotter than surrounding countryside, and tall residential towers with their immense heat-absorbing mass function as thermal storage devices that radiate warmth deep into the night. This is not merely a question of personal discomfort during a heat wave. It is a direct mathematical assault on food preservation, and we will walk through that calculation shortly. None of these three forces is a hypothetical scenario. They are measured, published realities. The conversation has shifted. It is no longer a debate about whether a household in a high-rise requires a strategic larder. The inquiry now is precisely how to construct one within the physical limits of the building's skeleton.
That necessity introduces the framework. Chapter 2, the physics of collapse, mass, load, and the 40-pound ceiling. When apartment occupants finally commit to storing provisions, they almost universally commit a precise, dangerous error. They select a single zone, often a hallway closet or a pantry corner, and begin piling dense 5-gallon containers of grain, flats of canned vegetables, and heavy water jugs directly against the drywall. What they have just assembled is what structural engineers label a point load, a dangerous concentration of mass on a tiny footprint within a structure rated for a uniformly spread burden. Here is the standard that nearly everyone scrolls past without reading. The International Residential Code, section R301.5, mandates a minimum evenly spread live load of 40 pounds for every square foot of living space. That metric is the foundational engineering assumption for almost every residential floor in the nation constructed under contemporary rules. The vital word is spread. The math presumes the weight is diffused across the entire span. It does not assume the entire mass is crushed into a 4-foot by 4-foot coat closet. Now, let us compute what a genuine reserve actually tips the scales at. A single 5-gallon container of water weighs roughly 42 pounds. A similar bucket packed with rice weighs about 33 pounds. A full bucket of dense liquid gold, honey, clocks in at roughly 60 pounds. If you stack just 10 mixed containers within a tiny closet footprint that measures 12 square feet, you are concentrating 400 to 500 pounds of downward force into a section the joists were designed to support less than 480 pounds in a distributed fashion. And that terrifying figure assumes you have added zero shelving weight, no human body standing there, and no furniture on the adjacent span. The physical countermeasure is what seasoned space-conscious preparers call the load distribution doctrine. Heavy reserves must travel against load-bearing walls, which in typical apartment construction run perpendicular to the floor joists and channel gravity directly into vertical supports rather than bouncing across the middle of an unsupported span. Mass must be fragmented across several rooms, never pooled in one spot. Drums and buckets sit on the perimeter of the room, never clustered in the center of a long joist leap. There is a shelf rating deception you must also know. A shelving rack's total bay capacity, meaning the entire unit's structural tolerance, is almost never the sum of the individual shelf limits. A rack marketed with 4 decks rated for 200 pounds each is rarely engineered to hold 800 pounds in aggregate. The bay limit is generally 50% of that sum, and in cheap units, often far less. This represents one of the most widespread mechanical failure triggers in compact food storage. The physical distress signal you must watch for is any perceptible sag, any audible groan, any joist or shelf deflecting visibly from the horizontal plane. That is the engineering equivalent of a dashboard emergency light. It is not a prediction of future trouble, it is a documented cry for intervention. Chapter 3, the silent spoiler, the metropolitan heat trap. If the structural danger is what brings the ceiling down, the thermal danger is what silently ruins the nutrition. There is a foundational law in food chemistry known as the Q10 coefficient. It dictates that for a vast array of chemical and biological decay reactions, things like lipid rancidity, browning enzymes, and vitamin breakdown, the destruction rate roughly doubles with every 10 degrees Celsius or 18 degrees Fahrenheit jump in ambient temperature. The protective inverse is equally powerful. Chop the storage temperature by 18 degrees and you effectively double the lifespan of the nutrient. This is not campfire anecdote. It descends directly from the Arrhenius equation, a bedrock formula used globally for predictive shelf life analysis. A standard Q10 figure for packaged food sits between 2 and 3, which means this doubling rule is actually a conservative estimate, not an exaggeration. Now, fuse this science with the urban heat battery effect. A kitchen pantry shelf in a scorching Phoenix or Houston apartment tower that sits consistently at 85 degrees Fahrenheit is operating dangerously above the 67-degree assumption that drives those shiny 25-year shelf life marketing claims. Under the iron logic of the Q10 coefficient, that pantry's real-world endurance suddenly looks closer to half of what the label boasts. The quarter-century sealed grain becomes 12-year grain. The 2-year can of vegetables shrinks to a 1-year window. The thermal death zones inside a typical unit where you must never place long-term storage.
First, the space immediately adjacent to a refrigerator where the exhaust coils bleed heat and raise the microclimate 10 to 15 degrees. Second, the upper cabinet above a range because heat stratifies, and this zone is a brutal slow cooker for dry goods. Third, any wall segment that takes direct afternoon solar radiation, especially west-facing exterior barriers in southern latitudes. And fourth, the attic-adjacent closet where summer highs can sail past 100 degrees. The tactical answer is to map the coolest interior microclimates of your unit, usually interior closets oriented north, the lowest cabinets hugging internal walls, and the floor slab of any storage space, and to push your most heat-sensitive items there. Oils, fat emulsions, and dairy powders belong in the coldest pockets. Grains and pulses, possessing greater thermal tolerance, can defend the slightly warmer perimeters. Ambient dampness is the second environmental enemy, and here health code standards become a tactical ally. Dense multi-unit buildings habitually have weaker passive breathability than detached homes, meaning humidity gets trapped. This is precisely why standard cardboard packaging is utterly unacceptable for any reserve meant to outlast a season. The professional benchmark, and what federal food safety guidelines direct toward for prolonged archiving, is a rigid foil laminate bag with oxygen scavenging sachets, sealed inside a food-grade polymer bucket. That two-shelled barrier neutralizes oxygen influx and ambient moisture, and it is a non-negotiable requirement for any calorie intended to persist beyond a single year. Chapter 4. The Architecture of the Invisible, Dead Space Mining. This is where cramped space readiness transforms from a chore into an art, because the apartment occupant possesses an asset that the suburban garage owner totally ignores, the empire of invisible cubic inches. The rule is elegant. In a standard apartment measuring 700 to 900 square feet, there exists roughly 30 to 40% unused vertical and concealed volume above the eyeline of furniture, below the plane of the bed, behind the facade of the sofa, atop kitchen cabinetry, and inside the upper third of closet atmospheres. Most of that volume is optically invisible. None of it is listed on your rental agreement. The dead space techniques worth memorizing are these. First, the underbed repository. A standard queen mattress lifted on 6-inch risers yields roughly 24 cubic feet of climate-stable volume, enough to swallow 15 to 20 mylar-sealed buckets of grains and legumes stored flat, distributing weight safely across the broad sleeping footprint without drawing a single glance. Second, the closet false floor. Constructing a 6-inch elevated platform inside a standard closet using simple plywood and cinder supports produces a hidden lower compartment for water bricks or low-rotation supplies, while the surface above continues to function normally for daily access. Third, modular liquid camouflage. Rectangular stacking water bricks designed precisely for this function can be locked together as the load-bearing chassis of a coffee table, an end table, or a seating bench, then veiled with a simple textile drape or finished wooden top. Each 5-gallon rectangle supplies roughly 3 days of emergency hydration for 2 individuals, and a single small end table framework can conceal 4 to 6 bricks, bridging a 1 to 2 week disruption invisibly. Addressing water storage early in the architecture is critical. The standard planning consensus, consistent with both emergency management guidance and humanitarian organization protocols, is 1 gallon of water per person per day. For a 2-person apartment, a 2-week hydration safety net demands roughly 28 gallons, which is precisely 6 of those stackable rectangular bricks. That is 1 piece of disguised living room furniture. Vertical wall efficiency comes next. Magnetic tool strips keep spice tins, steel canned goods, and small metal implements suspended on the vertical plane, liberating floor and shelf space for the bulk mass.
Over-the-door canvas organizers handle lightweight, high-rotation items at zero floor cost. The strategic goal is to float all lightweight goods up into the vertical void, so that the floor perimeter and load-bearing walls remain reserved solely for the heavy gravitational anchors, the buckets, the liquid bricks, the dense cases. Above cabinet storage is the secondary tier. The gap between the crown of standard kitchen cabinets and the ceiling is often 6 to 18 inches of pure unused airspace. It is not thermally ideal, given the natural rise of hot air, but it is perfectly serviceable for items with low thermal sensitivity: paper supplies, sealed dry pasta in foil, and household sundries. The safety discipline here is non-negotiable. Never send heavy mass high.
The center of gravity is a survival factor in seismic zones, and a cascading case of canned meat from above eye level is a catastrophic blunt force event. Heavy reserves travel low, light reserves float high. Chapter 5. The Density Equation. What earns a place on the floor? The calculus for the apartment prepper is fundamentally different from that of the rural landowner. Volume is the enemy, not the bank account, and the question therefore becomes ruthless. Which staple food provides the maximum metabolic output per cubic inch of space occupied? The macronutrient numbers deliver an unambiguous winner. Pure dietary lipid yields approximately 9 calories per gram of mass. That is more than double the 4 calories per gram offered by carbohydrate or protein. Let that ratio land heavily, because it redraws your entire storage geometry. 9 calories per gram versus 4. In volumetric terms, this means oils and saturated fats provide roughly 4,000 calories per pound of weight, whereas whole cereal grains provide closer to 1,600 calories. For the identical load on your floor joists, fat stores more than twice the survival energy. This is why when square footage is the bottleneck, fats are secured first, then concentrated sugars, then cereals, then everything else. The sequence is dictated by physics, not palate. The practical reserve list in strict priority order is as follows: cooking oils and clarified butter. This is the greatest calorie per cubic inch staple available at a civilian price point. Clarified butter, known as ghee, is shelf-stable for years without refrigeration when packed properly, and it serves as the crucial lipid carrier needed for the human body to absorb fat-soluble vitamins A, D, E, and K. Deprived of this fat vehicle, the body simply cannot unlock those vitamins from other foods, no matter how nutritious they look on paper. The supply reality for seed oils is tightening. USDA tracking indicates persistent price elevation, with the global vegetable oil index running roughly 65% above its long-term trend line, driven partly by biofuel mandates that now swallow nearly 30% of planetary production. The purchase window for affordable oil is observably shrinking in real time. Honey is the next priority. A 5-gallon pail of honey bears down with roughly 60 pounds of mass, and it is infinitely shelf-stable when sealed against ambient water vapor. Honey's intrinsic moisture, held below 18%, and its acidic range between 3.5 and 4.5 pH, create a sterile field where microbes simply cannot propagate. Sealed vessels of honey recovered from ancient Egyptian burial chambers have been found perfectly edible. There exists no other food with this dual payload of caloric density and immortality. Following this, vacuum-sealed yeast and instant coffee. Hard-compressed vacuum bricks of yeast occupy about 1/3 the volume of their loose-packed jar equivalents. A single half-pound brick provides the leavening equivalent of dozens of glass jars and stores indefinitely when held in a cool, dark environment. Mylar-sealed white rice, hard wheat, rolled oats, and dried legumes form the bulky carbohydrate foundation of the reserve, and their shelf life, when properly sealed against oxygen, stretches reliably beyond 2.5 decades. The packaging protocol matters more than the farm source. Grocery store rice, in its original porous packaging, offers 1 to 2 years of stability. That exact same rice transferred into a Mylar bag with an oxygen absorber instantly becomes a 25-year asset. The discipline of rotation is first in, first out, always drawing from the oldest container and refilling from the rear of the queue.
This is the identical inventory movement system used by commercial food service distributors, and it is the only mechanism preventing a living pantry from fossilizing into a static, quietly degrading stockpile. Freeze-dried food warrants a direct mention here because it dominates the commercial narrative. Freeze-dried meals are legitimate engineering. They lock in flavor and nutrition with multi-decade stability and rehydrate in minutes. The trade-off in a confined space is bulk and expense. Freeze-dried products are costly per calorie and voluminous per serving compared to raw staples sealed in foil. The tactical role for freeze-dried rations in an urban reserve is as a supplementary morale and convenience layer, not the caloric backbone. Raw staples in Mylar win on density and economics. Freeze-dried wins on speed and variety. Salt, sugar, and white vinegar, chemically inert, functionally eternal. These are not optional. Salt rules electrolyte balance, meat preservation, and basic palatability. Sugar delivers fast metabolic fuel and psychological relief. Vinegar handles surface sanitation, food preservation, and basic wound chemistry, multivitamins, and fat-soluble sources.
A long-term reserve built entirely on grains develops a predictable nutritional gap in vitamins A, C, D, and E. A compact reserve of broad-spectrum multivitamins and shelf-stable fats bridges that gap perfectly until normal supply chains restore. The stored value comparison is illuminating. A 5-gallon pail of Mylar-packed white rice, fully assembled, costs approximately $45 to $60 and provides roughly 45,000 calories with a multi-decade shelf life. The retail equivalent, bought in 1-pound bags and replaced every 2 years, costs more than triple that figure over the same horizon and provides absolutely zero security during a supply interruption. The reserve is not simply cheaper per calorie, it is the only configuration that functions when normal access disappears. Chapter 6. The Psychology of Eating, Appetite Fatigue, and the Domestic Spirit. There is a dimension of this work that almost no voice in the survival space discusses honestly, because it is not visually dramatic and it does not make a compelling photograph. It is the phenomenon of appetite exhaustion. A storage plan composed entirely of rice, legumes, and hard grain is technically sufficient for caloric survival. It is also, after roughly 14 days of repetition, psychologically corrosive. Military nutrition researchers have documented a pattern in extended field operations where the human organism, confronted with monotonous food under high-stress conditions, begins to reject it. Soldiers undereat, shed weight, suffer cognitive decline, and become increasingly demoralized. This is not weakness. It is a measurable physiological response to sensory monotony under duress. The countermeasure is straightforward and costs almost nothing. A serious reserve includes flavor and morale boosters alongside the macronutrient base. A spectrum of spices, fermented hot sauces, dried herbs, instant coffee, tea, salt, sugar, vinegar, dried mushrooms, concentrated stock, and a modest stash of comfort calories like dark chocolate, nut butter, and fruit preserves. These items consume a fraction of a percent of the total storage volume, and they safeguard what one military study labeled the domestic spirit, the household's capacity to maintain morale, structure, and routine during a window when the exterior world provides no normal rhythm. In an apartment where spatial confinement during a disruption may feel more intense than in a detached house with a yard, the morale layer is not a luxury, it is functional infrastructure. This is not a grim forecast. This is a strategy for a resilient existence inside the actual constraints of modern urban life. The micro action is deceptively simple: 2 items per trip. On your next 3 routine grocery runs, add just 2 targeted items each time: a bag of rice and a bottle of oil, a jar of honey and a flat of canned tomatoes, a 4-pound bag of salt and a pack of coffee. That is 6 items in 3 weeks. Repeat this rhythm for 90 days and you have built, without panic, without debt, and without eluding anyone, a 30-day strategic buffer in whatever closet gap, underbed cavity, or false floor void your apartment yields. Then walk the load principle. Tour your home with the structural check in mind. Identify the bearing walls, locate the coldest interior zone, map the invisible dead volume. Begin distributing the reserve along the perimeter in Mylar, off the hot floor of any thermal trap zone. Practice the first-in, first-out rotation from day 1. The work is incremental.
The math is favorable. The window is open right now, and it is narrowing as retail consolidation continues its quiet acceleration. Here's the question for the comment section. We genuinely want the data. Which single item, rice, cooking oil, beans, canned protein, or coffee, has demonstrated the most aggressive price spike or the most troubling shelf availability gaps in your specific zip code over the last 6 months? Drop the item and the city. Let us map the trends together. The collective signal is always more accurate than any single isolated source.